we are very glad to be having this discussion about how to bridge the gap between Europe and the global south. And I think it's a very unique opportunity because we are currently located in Budapest, in the heart of Europe, but we are not only talking about the global south without any representation of the global south itself, as usually Central European big geopolitical conferences do, but we have a wonderful partner here, so kudos to the organizers. This panel discussion will be talking about a lot of different topics that were already raised today, and we are trying to finalize the discussions about sustainable development, migration issues, and the shifting geopolitical alliances. But I don't want to take more of your time, so I'm very happy to give the floor to the first speaker of today, Mr. Petr Rulák, who is the former Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Czechia. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this dialogue. Let me reflect a bit on the question we are facing. I mean, the big topic is Europe and Global South. I believe that both concepts are actually quite broad, the concept of Europe and the concept of Global South. So the concept with which I'm more familiar is the concept of Central Europe. Because when we talk about Europe, we have many regions, many mentalities, many identities. So it may make sense to address the Global South from a Central European perspective. And of course, speaking about Global South is also too much of a generalization because we have very different regions which are summarized as Global South. I believe that from Central European perspective, especially Asia and Africa are the regions which are of utmost importance. Now, when I stress Central Europe, it means that Central Europe is somehow different from the rest. And you can find indeed many features, many elements which make this distinction. But with respect to our debate about Global South, I would say that the important feature is that Central European countries have never had colonies. So we had this distinction between former colonial great powers like France, UK, Spain, Portugal, etc., and Central European countries who were actually colonized themselves. We were colonized even though we use different terminology for this, but we have some empathy with people who were fighting for their independence. And indeed, in the 1950s and the 1960s, many Central European countries actually assisted Global South countries in their fight of liberation. You know, after 1990, we preferred to forget about it somehow because it was part of the socialist past. But I think good things should not be forgotten, even if they came into being in bad times. So, what makes us distinct from European colonialism or American neo-colonialism is the fact that we do not have this historical burden. Our past in connection with the Global South is not painful. It's actually quite cheerful because we were present when these countries were liberated in the 1950s and 1960s, and we were present there. Now, let me say what it means for our strategy. What should the Central European strategy be for Global South? I would call it pragmatic equality. Pragmatic equality. It's neither neo-colonial nor post-colonial. What does it mean? We should avoid all kinds of neo-colonial projects. Today, neo-colonial projects can be economic, but they are also ideological. When some countries try to impose their values, their institutions on the countries in Asia, Africa. There is no reason for Central European countries to be part of that. We should be pragmatic. We should also forget about any post-colonial guilt, because much of the West is tormented by the post-colonial guilt, and maybe rightly so, because they committed some real crimes. But again, we are not part of that. So in this respect, we can I think, frankly relate with others on the basis of equality and pragmatism. In this respect, when one of the questions is about the migration, I believe that the migration is quite healthy if it's individual, but if it's massive, it's destructive, especially from Central European perspective, because we are small countries, small nations. And massive migration coming from the Global South means basically the destruction of our identities. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Jurák. I guess we are starting with the Central European countries. So Ákos Márnyai, who is the advisor to the president of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Noemi. Indeed, the time frame provided for is quite brief, so I would like to focus only on certain aspects of the questions, and namely of difficulties of the establishment of mutually beneficial partnerships. Partnerships can, of course, be established in many fields, in culture, security, economy. However, when considering this question regarding the European Union and the Global South, it is the economy that comes into mind, as the EU is an international organization originally dealing with economic cooperation, and moreover, it is the common trade policy that falls into the exclusive field of competence of the EU. Therefore, the question is whether what the EU does in this field satisfactory for its own member states and for its partners in the Global South. And the answer seems to be, unfortunately, mostly to the negative. We are facing a leadership crisis, or as many say, a polycrisis in Europe. Some countries, like Hungary, are looking for answers and possible ways out, as Balázs Orbán said this morning, with the aim of saving ourselves. That is what the connectivity approach is about. The problem is that major stakeholders in Europe seem today to be unable to deal with the difficulties of the EU, but instead only trying to keep their heads above the water internally, like Germany or France does. And this also affects the international partnership building capacity of the EU, as partners around the globe does not know what Europe thinks. Clear-cut policy directions would be necessary, otherwise the trading partners of Europe would turn away from us if they cannot find a negotiation partner in Brussels, which seems to be the case in some cases. This is the internal dimension of the issue. The external dimension is at the same time that everyone needs to realize that multipolarity has arrived and will stay with us. This also means that while up until very recently, states of the Global South were urged to look at the US and the EU as the main trading partners, now the situation has changed. The Global South has the power and the willingness in more and more cases to choose from several trading partners and even to establish similar connections among themselves. The result, as many speakers have referred to it rightly, that Europe has become only one of the players and is not unavoidable anymore in the fields of economic cooperation. With this same set, leadership crisis in Europe, the weakened status of the EU in the multipolar world order, and the aim to promote economic cooperation, and some extra business aspects still come into play. And that is the requirement of conditions for cooperation which by their nature do not belong to the deal. In other words, the export of European values. Just referring briefly to the panel in the morning, European values do exist. This is not the question. The question is, to what extent should Europe insist on transferring these values to its partners in the future? Having the above said, and considering that there are other poles in the world which might satisfy the needs of the Global South countries, it might happen that these countries turn away from the Union, pushing it in an even worse situation day after day. There are, however, good signs on one end, like the so-called Global Gateway strategy, which was set up to organize investments in countries of the Global South. On the other hand, however, things started to get a harsh direction from the leaders of Europe, which went as far as that former High Representative Joseph Borrell publicly compared the EU and other parts of the world using the metaphor of a well-kept garden and the jungle, saying that Europe needs to take good care, otherwise the jungle might run it down. These political statements, quite understandably, do not help the establishment of new connections between Europe and the states of the Global South. In my view, the first step in every situation is the correct identification of the situation. The EU has probably got used to the style that it is the community which comes up with ideas and solutions. Today, however, the situation has turned away from this. The new direction in the multipolar world order is that the EU is much more a co-creator and not an alone saint-setter. This means that any possible tone of power politics needs to be turned down. Again, as Balázs Orbán said, we are the junior partner in most of the cases. And Europe needs to listen carefully to the old saying, according to which it is only the fool who speaks a lot and listens a few, while the wise man does just the other way around. Thank you very much.
Thank you. After this very critical explanation, let me give the floor to Ayo de Alakia, who is among others the chair of the board of directors at FIND.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation once again. I'm also going to address the questions, but also speak to a little bit of the past. Peter, if I may, spoke a little bit about some of the past with Central Europe is not painful, it is actually in some ways quite cheery. I believe that part of what we from the Global South, and I very firmly place myself in that category, see is that we are forgetting the past and that we're not teaching history, we're not teaching what has gone before. For too long, Europe has seen very much of the Global South, particularly Africa and parts of Asia. Of course, we're not mentioning specifically Latin America here, but Peter, you referred from a Central Europe perspective to Asia and Africa. You've seen it through the lens of a colonial master. I had a conversation a few years ago with one of your commissioners, former commissioner of the European Union, just around Brexit, where he said that we in Europe for too long have relied on Britain, on that lens to see the rest of the world. And I think therein lies a little bit of the conundrum, because if you rely on one who are seen as the power to shape for you how you see the rest of us, there is an inherent issue there. I like to say that people often think with an accent. So if you're all thinking with a British accent, then this is part of the issue. I, of course, have a British accent because of the colonial past, because my father bought my education, paid rather a lot of money for it in a British boarding school. So the accent is definitely from the UK, but the mindset is definitely from Africa. So when we talk about the questions around increased migration, I will also agree that the answer there is no. We also must be the mistresses in Africa and in Asia of our own destiny. We cannot be expected to migrate or want to migrate wholesale to Europe. Mass migration is a bad idea. However, there is conflict, there's polycrisis, there's climate, all of these things going on in Africa and Asia and other parts of the world that are the drivers of migration. Too often, we see many countries, external parties, who are the ones who are often pushing those drivers, the push factors. Because there is a poem by, I forget his name, Thomas Swire, I believe it is, that nobody leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. Nobody wants to leave home. If you look at Syria today, there are people flying back, driving back in their millions to go back because they believe that there is safety. Even if they're going to a place where there is only ruin, at least it is home. Just a few days ago, I received an honorary degree from a university in the United Kingdom. The most beautiful, beautiful part of that entire ceremony was that they brought home to me. I live in Abuja in Nigeria, and when I walked in for that ceremony, there were Yoruba drums drumming as I walked in. It brought tears to my eyes because nobody leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. So how do we work together from a geopolitical and a geo-economic perspective to ensure that that home is not the mouth of a shark, to ensure that people want to stay in their countries, to ensure that they stay where their grandmother, their grandfather, where their cousins, where their families are from. No one wants to leave home. Shifting geopolitical alliances brings me to my immediate sub-region. Let me refer you to Mali, to Niger, to Burkina Faso, to Chad, to Equatorial Guinea. These countries have recently rejected wholesale France and Europe and all of that involvement. They're rejecting the currency. Senegal, the latest, actually quite surprisingly, the latest just in the past week. The reasons is because of these perceived inequities, the inequality, the fact that we feel that the injuries that are felt are being they're being minimized within Europe and the rest of the world. Those injuries are not just historical, but in the era of COVID, and if I may quote President Cyril Ramaphosa, who said in the Paris meeting about a year ago, that during COVID we felt like we were beggars. We felt like we were begging at times, and we felt like there would be droppings from the table. Let me tell you, that was something that generated a lot of resentment. We felt like life in the Northern Hemisphere was so much more important than our lives in the global South. One of the things I am most known for saying is that a life in New Delhi must be worth the same as a life in New York. A life in Abuja must be worth the same as a life in Amsterdam. Until we begin to recognize those realities, and as I looked across to my sisters who spoke earlier about gender equality, until we realize that on the totem pole of life, those of us women from the global South are very much often the lowest of the low. We are often the most persecuted, the most abused in this world. Until we turn those tables of gender inequality, we turn the tables of inequity around, we are not going to see collective progress. And what the world needs is not Europe and the global South. We need the entire world. We need to come together as a global community to fix this global crisis we're in. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to also give the floor to another Central European speaker, Mr. Jerzy Kwaszewski, who is the president of the board at Ordo Juris Institute for Legal Culture from Poland.
Thank you very much. In 1951, Carl Schmitt pointed out that for 400 years, from the 16th to the 20th centuries, the structure of European international law had been shaped by a fundamental reality: colonies and the conquest of a new world. This Western-centric legal framework defined international relations throughout the 20th century as well. Just as Balázs Orbán stated today, 2024 may become a final year of this old era. It's becoming increasingly clear that we need a bold new paradigm, one that is suited for an emerging multipolar global order of sovereignty and multilateral cooperation. Legal scholars associated with the Global South through the third wave approaches to international law doctrine emphasize that mid-20th century attempts to establish a framework for global cooperation under the UN Charter often masked an unsettling truth: a renewed attempt to exert dominant control by historic empires and powerful groups, transforming international frameworks into instruments of a new hegemony we now call global governance. As Professor Martti Koskiniemi powerfully articulates, empire is today pursued within and through intergovernmental cooperation, through development cooperation, intervention in failed states, post-conflict reconstruction, international criminal courts and trials, and it is clear that international law stands quite at the heart of it. In the realms of politics, legal doctrine, and international relations, we witness an escalating wave of distrust toward these global governance mechanisms. Many perceive them as lacking democratic oversight and imposing ideological solutions that overlook the rich tapestry of cultural, religious, and national identities they affect. Amidst this landscape, my expectations concerning initiatives taken now by UN as Pact for the Future or World Economic Forum slogan "Rebuild Trust" are limited at best. However, true hope lies in the global resurgence of sovereignty movements, often labeled as conservative populism. This shift signifies a break from centralized globalization and heralds the reaffirmation of cultural, national, religious identities as the foundation of genuine international cooperation. It is our duty to ensure that this resurgence does not spiral into isolationism. Instead, it should inspire us to cultivate international cooperation that emerges organically from the grassroots, rooted in the affirming of our diverse civilizational identities. The Abraham Accords and the Declaration of Human Fraternity exemplify these transformative bottom-up approaches to build a new paradigm of cooperation grounded in identity affirmation. Yet, old ways linger and demand our critical scrutiny even now. Take the post-Cotonou Agreement, through which the European Union extends its ideological and Western-centric influence over African, Caribbean, and Pacific. conditionally tying financial support and economic cooperation to the adoption of European perspective on human rights and sustainable development. Finally, Central European states, energized by their dynamic economies and shaped by profound memories of already mentioned political dependence and their quasi-colonial policies of the Russian, Prussian, Ottoman empires exerted over the Central European sphere. We are uniquely positioned to serve as a vibrant bridge between the global South and the global West. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jerzy. Next speaker is going to be Ralf Schellhammer, who is, among others, an assistant professor at the University, Webster University in Vienna.
I'll try to keep myself short to allow more room and more space for the discussions. Henry Kissinger once jokingly said, or half-jokingly said, when he wants to talk to Europe, whom should he call? And I kind of have the same question when it comes to the Global South. If I want to speak to the Global South and I pick up the phone, whom am I going to call? And that is a serious problem, because in many ways, if the defining quality of the Global South is that it's not the West, I don't think that's going to be enough. And I think we have to be honest, if we talk about communicating or trading or interacting with the Global South, that the Global South itself doesn't speak with one voice. Do Ethiopia and Eritrea have the same interests? Venezuela and Argentina? Is the interests of India and the Democratic Republic of Congo, are they aligned? So I think this is, we talk about such a huge number of countries that I'm not entirely sure whether the term Global South, apart from being a geographical denomination, is actually particularly helpful. And from this I would derive the advice how to deal with it on a state-by-state basis, on a pragmatic, if you want, individual basis. We heard a lot today about that this is the dawn of the age of sovereignty, that this is the age of multipolarity. Well, but very often I hear that the world apparently is once again divided into two poles, at best three, the Global South and the West, and then maybe some countries in between, which is the exact opposite of the argument that we hear. So I think even in our debates, we have to be clear about the terms that we are using. So either it's going to be a multipolar world, or it's going to be a kind of a reshaped form of a bipolar world. But in many ways, it strikes me as the following problem, which is that many of these alternative models are very much defined only in their opposition to the West. That is fine by me. I can both morally and ethically very much understand why this is the case. But is that really enough to create a functioning, unified coalition of states? And I don't think that really is the case with, to return to the term, with the Global South. Right? We know that many of the member states, for understandable reasons, are very jealously guarding their sovereignty. But the difference then between something like the European Union, which we have been heavily criticizing today, so maybe at some point somebody has to say something positive about it, is the willingness to hand over sovereignty to supranational institutions. Again, that might have been a mistake. I'm open to have this debate. But nothing of that kind is going to happen very soon anywhere in the world. Nobody seriously believes, I think even in this room, that China or India would hand over, for example, their monetary policy to a supranational institution, that they would give up their national control over coal and steel in the way that the Germans and the French did, because they look at these international institutions as means to ensure their national sovereignty. So this is something that we have to keep an eye on, that even those who are members of the Global South are very keen on protecting their national sovereignty. And it's very difficult then, as I said, apart from it as a rhetorical tool and as a geographical denomination, to speak of the Global South as an entity, an institutionalized organization that has agency, because it's so many member states with potentially so many diverging interests. As I mentioned, Argentina, Venezuela, Ethiopia, Eritrea. So I think we have to be very careful. We use a European lens. We say, okay, there's the EU, and what would be similar to the EU, or the Global South, or the BRIC states? But they are completely different. They are built on an entirely different vision. And once again, I take no sides on which vision is better, but they are different. The European, or Western European, if you want, vision was one of that the nation state is going to wither away. It's the postmodern, the post-national vision, where gradually states give up their national identities and hand over power to supranational institutions. That vision is not shared in other parts of the world. This is not a vision of BRICS. Right? BRICS exists in order to ensure the sovereignty of its member states. The European Union, at least in its earlier days, existed to do the exact opposite. So I think we must be careful not to compare things that are very different.
Thank you, Ralf. Our last initiator speaker is going to be Mr. Fulufelo Netsevera, who is a founding member of the South African BRICS think tank.
Thank you very much for the invitation to this gathering. Now, the topic hinges on global north, global south, EU, global south relations. I want to speak specifically about relations with Africa in particular. And I think as Africa leaps from one crisis to the next, from one skirmish to the next war, in Eritrea, in the Sahel region, I don't think this makes major headlines globally, not even here in Europe. Now, does it feature at the EU Parliament? And we've got grudges with the EU in particular, specifically in relation to Rwanda, the Rwandan genocide. This is a point of importance and interest to us in the global south and specifically in Africa. EU continue to be the biggest trading partner of Africa. However, the trading terms, as somebody has just alluded to here now, in Colonial and everywhere else, are very much dictated from the global north. We can be rest assured that the trade balances are going to be overturned in the coming few years. China has invested in 2023 around 42 billion. It has committed 51.2 billion for 2024-25. And there is serious resentment that is historic towards the global north because of colonialism, and I do take cognizant of the point that you make about Central Europe and the support that you have made extended to the liberation of the African countries. But I think we need also to look at the post-Washington consensus and the role of corporates in Africa in particular. Because not only should we be talking about states, we should be talking about corporates. And the perversion of democracy in Africa, the pollution that they perpetuate in Africa, and the tax evasion and many other serious ills associated with that. Of course, we know that corporates are perverting democracy even here in Europe, and it is something that we should continue to engage around. Unemployment crisis in Africa, which is fueling the migration patterns to the global north and to Europe in general, is an outcome of the usurping of powers by the corporates that operate in our particular states. So the sovereignty of the African states is at threat, and I think these dot-com globalist, capitalist corporates continue to perpetuate poverty in Africa, exploitation of wage disparities. We need a new deal. We definitely need a new deal whose terms are equality. Equality of trade, equality of employment, equality in terms of use of resources, and I don't think we have attained that to date. We didn't historically, we haven't even now, and I think we need to think seriously about how we move forward for mutual benefit between Africa and Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you all to the initiators. We have already touched upon a lot of different topics, from national sovereignty on historical aspects, whether we can even talk about unified institutions like the Global South, whether European Union has sufficient policies. So I firstly would like to ask Mr. András Király, who is a former ambassador of Hungary to India, to address the already mentioned issues.
Thank you, Noemi. Perfect picture from India. Thank you for the organizer. I spent 2 years in India, and before that 5 years in South Africa, and these 7 years were the best professional years of my life, so I really enjoy being here with you. And I remember reading fantastic books by an African author. His name was Chinua Achebe, and its title is Things Fall Apart. And somehow it reminds me all the time that when we are addressing this kind of questions, that how deep this runs in our history. On the other hand, as a diplomat, my approach is rather simplistic and practical. It's a diplomatic perspective, after all. When talking about the global South, my starting point is that this is a geopolitical reality more than an ideological construct. And if it's a geopolitical reality and it's going to stick around for quite a while, I believe, then we need to address like that. And the reason my priority is on the geopolitical reality and not on the ideological construct is exactly the argument that Mr. Drulak explained in his opening speech. So we people from Central Europe have a different or kind of a nuanced approach to this issue regarding historic injustices. What we can do in this respect, we from Central Europe we can share our experiences regarding our own historic injustices and how we manage to deal with it. And mainly or mostly, or the issues that were more successful, it was when we addressed it on a scholarly manner. So not in a diplomatic, but on a scholarly manner, because that cuts deep. That's really something that teaches societies about coexistence, about historic injustices, about the past, and so on. And if that's done, as we did it with several neighboring countries in early 90s, nobody remembers, but that it was a huge issue. Like 30 years ago, in our specific case, it was a very, we had the similar discussions about whether historic injustices can create a situation which translate into economic or other benefits. Well, it didn't. That was a totally different track. So that was kind of our homework that we had to do on bilateral group setting in this region before doing something else. So I think reconciliation in this respect and talking about historic injustices is extremely important, but it should be done first and foremost in the academic arena and not in the diplomatic one. And lastly, I think that if Global South is going to stick to be here and multilateralism and multipolarity is going to be here for a long time, then instead of competition, we need to focus on cooperation. And that's my last word. Thank you.
Such a nice last words. Rami Desai, the floor is yours. You're currently a Distinguished Fellow at the India Foundation.
Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank Gladden and Samir for really inviting me here. It really has been an insightful day. When we talk about bridging hemispheres, Europe and Global South, let's be clear, no connectivity, no changes in global alliances can bridge the gap unless there is mutual respect for each other's national interests and the right to make decisions based on our own national priorities. For most of Global South, and at least for India, I can say this, it seems like the Global North has not shed its colonial lens as yet. This lens takes on many different shades. Either at times it's purposefully biased colonially with a sense of superiority, or on the other hand, it overcompensates based on colonial guilt, rather patronizing. Neither is necessary. My area of expertise, as a few of you would know, is the neighborhood around India, especially the northeastern borders, but also everything that impacts India. One of the areas that I look very closely at is Myanmar and its impact on India's borders. So to illustrate my point, let me take an example from India's neighborhood and the complex chaos that ensues in Myanmar. The chaos in Myanmar is not really understood by a lot of people because it's really complex. Yet, on one hand, while it's complex, the US and the European Union has imposed sanctions. The US sanctions in Myanmar are called Burma 2020, which is provocative enough because Burma is a colonial label. For Myanmar, that traditional Myanmarese shun, the US and Europe has sanctioned the military junta while supporting the umbrella group of various ethnic armed organizations, which is a nicer way of saying militia groups. This stance pushed in the name of democracy and elections, yet in Bangladesh, as elaborated and pointed out by the very eloquent Kanchan Gupta, a regime change was engineered in the same tone of wanting democracy, even though that regime change was based on an elected government, leaving India to deal with the repercussions of the instability of both the countries. When the repercussions of both these countries ended up in a border state of Manipur, European Parliament put an urgency resolution, which India countered very strongly. However, it left 1 billion Indians very, very upset with the European Union for internal interference. But let me quickly, I don't have a lot of time, let me talk about the green transition, the most virtue-loaded term, as it should be, but we must ask ourselves who's paying the price for this virtue. It is said that the global demand for heavy rare earth minerals, elements, is going to go up and explode by 700% by 2040 because it's usage of EVs and wind turbines. But even though the US Congress required companies to disclose the original of minerals like tin and gold, it excluded heavy rare earth elements. This was the same with the European Union 2021 regulation on conflict minerals. The Global South cannot be a sacrifice zone for Western ideals, and unless we understand this, the bridging of the Global South with the West will be difficult. Mr. Orban started this day by saying that this is going to be the era of sovereignty, and I think that is where we should start from. Thank you.
For now, we can open the discussion later. I will give the floor now to Tina Jadon, who is Parliamentary Private Secretary from Mauritius.
Thank you. I would like to first start by thanking the ORF and all the organizers of the Budapest Global Dialogue today. So today, after 2 decades into the 3rd millennium, we stand at a critical crossroad of not only the great divide between the North and the South, but more crucially amongst the human race. And as we gather to take stock of the progress achieved, it is very important to also take note of the cogitations and the limitations in the whole exercise in bridging the gap between, as we say, Europe and the Global South. I believe that this exercise warrants a total absence of complacency that should allow us to ask the fundamental question, which is, after 3/4 of a century of decolonization, have we really decolonized our mentality, our mindset, and our attitudes from both a North and a South perspective? It may sound dystopian, but unless this question is objectively and honestly addressed, all endeavors towards an egalitarian world will remain in the realm of utopia. I recall here the second panel from this morning, which I've been recalling, even the mic is falling, which actually left most of the room confused. Because if we are here talking about Europe as being looked up to, Europe and the European Union as a supporting pillar to other nations, and especially to us coming from the Global South and I would say to small island developing states like Mauritius, from where I come from, which is like a dot in the map. Then I asked myself, this discussion of this morning, where I feel there was a lot of dissonance, because what is the common goal? What is the common good? And when we talk about EU, I hear 27 different states, I feel that there was a lot of internal division and instead of commonality. And then it almost seemed like we were already accepting to be defeated by defeat. And what are we weaponizing? So that's my question. So instead of focusing on what unites us together, on what binds us together, and on hope, on trust, on what we can build together, we are actually already having a very negative conversation. So the whole point of having this dialogue, I have to remind ourselves that why are we here today? We are here to see what we can bring and how we can have Europe and the EU support to the global south. I have to say that from my 5-year tenure as the youngest MP of a government for Mauritius, I have been tirelessly championing the cause for SIDS, which are small island developing states, and the vulnerability index of which is highest within the Southern Hemisphere. And I have to say, if we talk about addressing challenges and bridging the gap, for instance, the first gap when we talk about climate justice and environmental cooperation, which is one of the most pressing challenges of our time, and it disproportionately affects the global south. So how can the EU, how can Europe help and play a critical role in supporting climate action? For instance, if we talk about the $100 billion per year commitment by developed countries to support the developing countries, I have to say that first of all, it has to be honored and expanded. For instance, SIDS, which need adequate and predictable support, including the climate change financing. So I urge that international institutions and blocs like the EU recognize that GDP or GNI per capita is not the sole measure of a country's development, and that we can look into what is called the multidimensional vulnerability index developed by the UN to integrate this into their policies and action, and instead of seeing the global south as a passive recipient of aid, to view them as active partners in the fight against climate change and other societal injustice, and also as an active partner for a shared future together.
Thank you, Tina. The floor will be given to Dr. Réka Máté, who is currently a research fellow, among others, at the University of Public Service, Ludovica.
Thank you for inviting me. I really liked many thoughts that were said before me, and one of them resonated very strongly with me, is thinking with an accent. I was schooled in the very elitist boarding school of the European Union, so my speech might have this European flair, let's say, but my thinking is very Hungarian, so it's very pro-national sovereignty. With that, I was looking at the questions of this panel, and I was thinking, okay, how do Europe and the global South have in common, and how can the differences be bridged? And schooled in the European Union's very elitist school, obviously I tend to think very technically, and the Global Gateway is one of the programs that the European Union has for this purpose. And I was trying to compare the Global Gateway with one of the other great investments coming from China, is the Belt and Road Initiative. And yes, with the Hungarian thinking and with the European accent, it just doesn't seem that the Global Gateway will achieve its purposes as it is currently. So if European Union would want to bridge the hemisphere, And I do understand that there are really not homogeneous groups in this global south, what we call it, but this is a geopolitical reality. But in this multipolarity, increasing multipolarity, the European Union is losing its place and its leading position. I think that it's for its own purpose, it should rethink how it thinks about investments and how it positions its investments. And what I mean by this, the European Union prides with its regulatory and normative power. And from what I get to hear, it's not very popular. And I do understand why it's not popular. My Hungarian might have seen this. Whereas when I put it in contrast with the Road and Belt Initiative, which offers much more money and without the political conditionality, it seems to me that it's a reasonable choice not to choose the European Union as a partner, but rather use the European Union as a leverage when discussing with other investments. And I think that European Union should think about whether they really want to be a part of the multipolar world with strong partners coming from the global south, or they want to keep this regulatory and normative power. Thank you.
Thank you, Reka. I will now turn to Kwame Ovino, Chief Executive Officer at the Institute of Economic Affairs from Kenya.
All right. Thank you. Perhaps I should take a... Okay, thank you. I'll speak about 4 things, but I'll start by talking about... I understand the impulse that exists in Central Europe to seek solidarity with Global South, or specifically African countries, by emphasizing the fact that you have no history of colonialism. I come from a country that was colonized, but that's 61 years ago. And there's a new generation of African people for whom the selling point will not entirely be just because we do not have a history of colonialism. So I think it needs to be an anti-colonialism argument plus something else, which is quality. And so I'll try and speak about what some of that quality may be. One, I think seeking global public goods and strengthening global public goods is still a strong selling point. And it's something for which African people, specifically speaking, or let me say East Africans or Kenyans, would hook their lines to. Anybody who seeks the strengthening of the provision of global public goods, they exist. Whether it's tackling global terrorism, the sale of arms, which has some very nefarious effects on the African continent specifically, is something that could be a selling. Because I think I have a problem with countries that say stuff like that, but actually some of those that push the most arms and dangerous things into the African continent and actually creates that. So that's first, basically global public goods. The second thing is immigration. Now, that's part of what we're talking about, mending fences and building bridges. The idea in Europe and Central Europe, it's much, much stronger, I think, in Central Europe than even in the older colonial powers, that many African people are dying to come to Europe is something you need to reconsider very seriously. I think the incentive is strong. I was in Germany a month ago, and I felt it as well, but it's not what your average African person is thinking. So if you're going to anchor your foreign policy or your gripes with Germany on the basis of the fact that, look, Germany's let too many people come here, I think you perhaps need to discuss that among yourselves a little bit more. So immigration is a question, but it is not that. I sit in Nairobi, and not many people are thinking that, well, let me go and live in Hungary, for instance. I mean, I like to visit here, but that's not what their first thing is. The third question is on energy transition. African people are increasingly rejecting the idea that we need to moderate energy demands from from carbon sources, partly because very many of them have carbon resources. I visited a country called Mozambique. Believe it or not, an income per capita of $800 per person per year. It's a miracle that people live on $800 per person per year. And it has enormous natural gas reserves. And to tell them that they are not going to have to trade those just so that they can get access into Europe is not just unjust, unethical, unfair, but it tells you that the ideas driving energy transition, I think, needs to be reconsidered as well. And the final one is a kind point from a person who likes Europe and the European experiment. I think it's a good thing for moderating global things. Just because Europe seems to lack vitality and is disagreed on one part about many other things, including the war and stuff like that, I don't think that makes it a global problem. I don't think it does. So the idea that just because Europe has a problem means the whole world must look at it, or Africa or other parts of the world must look at global issues through that lens, is one that requires reconsideration as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Kwame. I will now give the floor to Mr. Abdida Bian, who is Executive Director at the Center for Dialogue, Research and Cooperation from Ethiopia. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I would like to thank ORF and Budapest Global Dialogue team for inviting me. I will focus on migration, but a couple of issues on the economics of the relations between the West and Africa. I think everybody agrees that the net capital flow from Africa is more than the net capital to Africa from the West, because the economics is crafted in such a way that African countries continue to be suppliers of raw materials to Europe and other Western countries, while they are at the recipient end of. So that relationship has to be looked at. The second important point that one should look at is there are emerging centers of power that are competing for Africa's goods and services. It provides an opportunity, but there is a pressure on Africans on making those choices. To what extent Africa has to be allowed to make choices in that regard should be thought very, very well. Of course, in terms of migration, I understand the pressure it creates here. But I think it's also an opportunity for Europe in any way, because there is brain drain from Africa. Most educated intellectuals leave Africa. That helps Europe, but not necessarily Africa in that regard. Of course, the fact that there are emerging actors has provided Africa with alternatives, not only from China, India, and the global South in general, but even from the new actors like the Gulf. They have provided alternatives to resources in Africa. Because of that, I think Europe needs to change the modus operandi of its engagement with Africa. How? One is, I think, mutual respect. There is a need for mutual respect between Africa and Europe. I think the other important thing is, I think, economic equity. I think Europe has to think that Africa equally needs to make choices in terms of which technology, which economic partners that they want to have as partners. I think the other important thing is global challenges are shared challenges, and hence we have equal responsibility like the West in terms of addressing those global challenges. I think I will stop there.
Thank you for keeping the time. Our last speaker of the panel is going to be Mr. Krzysztof Zalewski, who is currently a president of the Mika Boyne Institute for Asian and Global Studies at Poland.
So thank you very much for this wonderful event and the organizers. That's, I think it's just the beginning of our conversation, although today I'm the very person who needs to end it. So I think many people coming from outside of Europe can be very confused. Because we have had a discussion about European disunity. And it's something very European, trust me. I've been working in Polish diplomacy before, and that's also how we deal with our problems in Brussels. We quarrel, we quarrel, we quarrel, and in the end of the night, we have a solution. So I think that's sometimes we are confused by ourselves and we don't project our ideas, our values in the best possible way because we are so focused on ourselves. And that's, I think, we need to understand that quarreling and this kind of discussion is a very European thing. But at the end of the day, up until now, we have a solution. And this thing, if we think about the idea about the West and Europe declining, there is something into it. But I just want to quote the very title of the book, Untergang des Abendlands, The Decline of the West. And it was, this book can be probably written now, but it was written 106 years ago and first published in 1918. So this idea about, declining Europe has history itself. And contrary to this mood in Europe, I'm quite optimistic. The reason for my optimism is, first of all, because I've probably come from the country which is probably quite well off, not despite of European integration, but because of European integration. So we joined 20 years ago, first the NATO for our security, and secondly, the EU for our prosperity. And it still works very much. And this gives me a kind of optimism, also in relation to our colleagues, friends, partners from the Global South. And I hear very carefully what we are saying, and that's inspiring also to my work and my institute. But I would just to emphasize that the European Union is still the provider of humanitarian aid, humanitarian cooperation, and development cooperation for many parts of the world. And I think we can do more, we can do better, but we are still doing something. I think with Europe, we need to share the technology, which is for the green transition and energy transition. And I think we should do it better. We should think creatively about finance. Global Gateway has been criticized. I understand, but at least we are having an alternative to Chinese Belt and Road. And I think the creating of alternatives and alternative partnerships is the way forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christoph. I don't know if our international guests know this, but this building actually, and this room actually used to house the Hungarian upper house of the parliament before the parliament building was done. So I highly encourage to honor the room and have real debates. I would like to give the floor to the lady over there.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all discussants and interventionists, or however you call it. Just for the sake of the clarity, I know it's a common thing that all of us are doing simply because it's easier, but the EU is not Europe. Europe is much larger than the EU. And as someone coming from Europe, but not an EU country, I always tend to emphasize this because it speaks a lot about this tendency to take European Union only as Europe. But the other thing, I was really inspired by Peter and by, I'm sorry if I don't pronounce your name, Ajod? Yeah. And I really envy you. And I envy people from Mali, I envy people from Democratic Republic of Congo, I envy people from Kenya, I envy people from Ethiopia, because colonialism is a past. I come from the country that has been under specific kind of colonial rule for the past 30 years. I envy the people of Mali and the president who dared to say 2 years ago in front of the French President Macron, arrête de nous patronner, stop patronizing us. or last year to the President of the Democratic Republic of Congo, who said the same thing to the French President. Unfortunately, I cannot do that. My country, I can go back tomorrow, and we have a patron, we have a colonial power that can, for example, fire me as a university professor. And this is a special kind of colonialism. Today, we didn't speak a lot about neo-colonial policies of international organizations, and I'm not talking about the EU per se. I've seen that. I've seen that in the reform of the country that I come from, Bosnia and Herzegovina. I've seen it all. And colonialism is present in the heart of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for all your comments. It's one of the last sessions. We're all tired and still so many good inspirational comments. I have two questions or rather points. First, the question, somebody said that the international justice structures are not legitimate anymore because there is a trust issue. Then what is the alternative? I would like, it's a genuine question. The second refers to the first intervention. It was Peter's. He was talking, what was disturbing for me is that he was treating identity as a fixed category. And I think it's not really like that. It can evolve, and it is also subject to national and international factors and the evolution of things. And we have to come to terms with this because migration is unescapable. We're all against mass migration, but unless the push factors go away, we just have to come to terms with it.
Mr. Druck, please respond quickly.
To some extent, I agree that identities are construction, so they do change, but they do change very slowly. So they do not change from one day to the other. They change actually in the space of centuries. So it still makes sense to talk about Central Europe as an entity which was here 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Maybe it will be here in 100 years again. So in this respect, I do agree that identities do evolve, but they evolve very, very slowly. They are almost like rocks. And with respect to migration, it was already mentioned, I didn't have time to develop on it, but what I think is very dangerous or very detrimental in migration is actually, look at these people who are leaving their countries, They are leaving their countries, and they would be beneficial for their countries. Most of them would be beneficial for their countries. If they leave their countries, it means brain drain. It means that these countries will not develop, because the people who could contribute to their development should have stayed there. Or you have people who are leaving their countries because their countries cannot find any sort of integration for them. Unfortunately, European countries will also struggle to integrate them. So you have cost on all the sides. So that's why I think that this massive migration is a real disaster, both for the countries which actually send these people or from which these people come, and for the countries to which these people arrive.
Thank you. The gentleman over there. Gentleman first and then. The gentleman first and then after.
Sorry, there was also another question on international justice. Maybe later on.
Later at the 1-minute discussions, the speakers will include the answers for that.
Thank you very much. I would like to stress two elements, and then maybe the panelists can comment on that. The first one is that EU sometimes is seen as a scapegoat to cover the failures of individual countries in EU. So it is very hard to blame EU, for example, for the demographic decline in European societies, or for the moral erosion, or even for the economic struggles that European countries are facing. How can we blame EU for the economic struggles of Germany right now? So it's sometimes we have to identify an enemy and to cover our domestic failures, one. The second is that there is a kind of ambivalence what we would like from EU, or how do we want to see EU. On one side, we want an EU that is a relevant actor on international politics. But to be a relevant actor on international politics, we need a unified Europe with a unified voice. So we need a deeper integration within EU. On the other hand, we want to preserve our sovereignty. But individually, European countries are too small to be important on international politics. So without solving this kind of ambivalence that exists in EU, I think that it's going to be difficult to have a relevant EU in international politics. Thank you.
Thank you. And the lady next to you, and then the panel will address the questions at the end.
It's just one comment about what someone said, I think it was the lady there, about the end of patronage of French with this regarding or related with the situation in Mali. I think that I know that the situation in Mali, because I personally was there fiscalizing the transition process. It's just, unfortunately, and I agree with you, the end of patronage, unfortunately, the question is that there was a real replacement of patronage. Instead of French, now it's a Russian patronage.
I just have a quick question on the global gateway, or maybe comment, because I heard that it was mostly the Europeans in the panel who spoke about global gateway, and I would be interested of the perception of countries in the global south, representatives of how do you see it, because on paper, it was clearly a reset. It was meant to be a reset, like a strategic reset to move away from development aid to strategic investment. And I think the EU, under the guidance of the Commission, is encouraging that sort of a shift. And I think we can be pessimistic about it, but I think that is a process that is happening. And there are question marks, but it's clear that it's a response to the BRI, and that's, I think, everyone knows that, but I would be curious to hear if anyone on the panel wants to comment on your perceptions of the global gateway as a solution, an alternative.
Would you like to? Okay, please go.
Thank you for the question. Like coming from the global south and from a small island developing state, I have to say that we do look up to the support, and for instance, be it in terms of inspired leadership, whether it's about building new pathways together, whether it's about fighting climate justice, climate financing, trade, and especially if we talk about trade. I heard earlier about COVID. We remember how we felt during COVID, and if we are supported and if we are empowered as a nation or as countries from the global south, and more importantly, I believe that it's about the lens, because coming from any country which is deemed to be part of global south, no one should feel that we are being looked down. Actually, as I said earlier, it's about changing the whole attitude, and I think that's the whole process. It's about, if we're talking about a commitment to building a new future together and bridging the hemispheres, and the gateway to a shared future is by having everyone being seen as equals and not looking down upon any other part of the world, or like creating the divide already by saying north, south. So already this is part of it, and the education is so important. We have a lot to learn, and we have a lot to also be grateful for. And of course, coming from a SEDS island, I say we do look forward for more inspired action instead of just talk, be it from the COP, be it from the United Nations, be it from the EU, be it from the World Trade Organization. So trade, education, leadership, climate justice, political stability and governance, of course, enforcing of the democratic values, all things that I think we really, really need to focus on. And I want to add on a word from one of our previous speakers who said we should also honor our history. For instance, those countries of the global south which have legacies of colonialism, imperialism, and exploitation with deep inequalities, we actually maybe have to learn from them and share the history to the other parts of the world, which can help to create and restore what I called a cultural restitution. Yeah, thank you.
I will now give the floor to the initiators, and please make sure to answer all the questions that were raised on the right. Mr. Dulac first.
Yes, I addressed some of these. I would like to address the point which was not raised by myself, but which I think important, and these are the doubts about so-called global justice, and I share these doubts, because when we look actually how the International Criminal Court is working, it was nicknamed to be the court just for Africa, and rightly so, because until recently it was just actually, it was quite biased in the cases it took. Now it's also the court for Putin. And the first really, the first breakthrough is now the case of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. So it's the first time, and it's actually the merit of South Africa which brought it. And I'm actually quite disappointed by the European reaction to it, because they say rule of law, and if it's about Netanyahu, they say, well, Bibi will be allowed to come. So that's why I share these doubts about international justice, and we should not try to resolve international conflicts, live in international conflicts by judges. It's not the work of judges. This is the work of diplomats. And then speaking about this global gateway, you know, the main problem of the European approach to the development aid, development cooperation, development assistance, no matter how you call it, is this patronizing attitude which is hidden in this concept of conditionality. And I cannot imagine that Brussels and Ursula von der Leyen would be able to overcome the conditionality. And on this, they can hardly actually be, they can hardly compete with Chinese, Indians, and others.
Thank you, Mr. Dulac. Ákos.
Thank you very much. I would like to address the question of the gentleman with regards to the European Union and the ambivalence on how we want to see Europe. You said that we would like to see, and I also said, that we would like to see the European Union as a major player in international politics, but, and then you argued that for that even deeper integration would be required. I wouldn't think this is the case. I mean, the European Union was really a major stakeholder for decades, even though the integration was even looser than it is today. And I had the chance and the luck to work for the European Commission as a stagiaire some 10 years ago already. And I only have the best opinion about the people who work at the Commission. I mean, they are really among the most intelligent and well-educated I ever met, speaking many languages, having the best diplomas and whatever. So the European Commission and the European Union does have the manpower to act more effectively. The problem is not the depth of the integration. The problem is the losing of focus. The European Union is starting to lose focus for many years and is dealing with issues with which it shouldn't deal with at all. And thereby, a lot of effort, a lot of energy, a lot of time is wasted on various issues instead of focusing on the economic issues, which could make the European Union once again a major stakeholder in international politics. Thank you.
I have a couple of questions I'd like to address. The first one is around the issue of migration and some of those conversations. I think we have to be very mindful about the language we use. I think calling mass migration dangerous and a disaster, whilst in a room like this, where we understand one another and where there is an understanding of the issues, is maybe okay. But we have to understand that language matters. And that sort of language is what leads to xenophobia and violence. And we have to be very careful not to go down that route. We have to understand what the drivers are of mass migration, and we have to refer to it in the proper terms. The next point I want to make is around the issues around, European Gateway and the former MP who talked about being empowered by others. We have to empower ourselves as Africans and as people from the Global South. And really one of the conversations we're not having here, the pink elephant in the middle of the room, is leadership. The issues is that we have leadership challenges in many of our countries, many of the parts of the world where we see these problems. And it's a chicken and an egg situation. It's a vicious cycle because we have for too long seen external powers promote and actively encourage regimes that will keep our people poor, that will keep those countries downtrodden. And then you complain when the effects of that downtrodden, the effects of that conflict now show up on your doorstep. We have to understand that it is a leadership challenge. We cannot have leaders of Europe, France, Germany, wherever they are, even Central Europe, warmly embracing leaders from countries who spend millions and millions of dollars, or hundreds of millions of dollars buying private jets instead of putting hospitals and schools down. This is the sort of thing that this conversation that needs to be had in rooms like this. And I say that because I sit next to an advisor to a president. It is really important that you also recognize that the leadership challenges in our countries are what are leading to your own problems domestically. My final point is that there needs to be reflexivity on both sides. We need to look at ourselves, and you also need to look at yourselves. What have we all contributed to this problem? We cannot talk about change and partnership if we're not reflexive and if we don't have the humility to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Jerzy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. As it comes to migration, we have to underline that we have our rights to keep our nations unified ethnically also, and we have to have our right to keep our nations safe when it comes to migration, and especially when the migration is already a major event, and we have millions of people from war zones like Ukraine inhabiting our Central European states. And also something that was missing from our discussion, we are already in the age of cobots, and soon humanoid AI robots with the natural language learning algorithms will revolutionize our industries and trade. And it will be the next years that we will observe this event and this process. And probably physical labor and migration demand will be matters of the past to much extent. And logically speaking, countries of the North will be less and less willing to accept migration. And one last sentence when it comes to international justice. International justice is an illusion. International justice may not be exerted if there is no international demos, if there is no international nation, if there is no international authority. So of course it will be always an illusion. It will be a court of the strong over the weak, or over those who are not under the jurisdiction of the court, like Vladimir Putin, like Lavrov, or like Netanyahu. So just to show a few examples of the answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jerzy. Ralph?
Very shortly, I think just a quick remark, which is one of the things, of course, we will also have to come to grips with in a potentially multipolar world is that in one way, shape, or form, imperialism will never come to an end. Neighbors, countries, as they get more powerful, will always meddle in the business of other neighboring states. Turkey does it in Syria, Russia does it in its neighbor states, China does it in the South China Sea. This comes with power. This is a natural thing. I think this idea that at least I sensed a little bit also during this panel debate is, oh, if the West retreats, then this will also be an end of other nations meddling in the business of yet other nations. This is never going to stop. And I think it's an illusion to believe that multipolarity also equals a happy world where everybody is equal. This is never going to happen, and I think we should prepare for that.
Thank you so much. Fulu Fellow.
Okay, thank you very much. Perhaps let me make a comment around the question of international justice, because I think that what we should keep in check is economic injustice. This is the most important as far as I'm concerned, so that there is some element of economic equality across the world, because all these ills that we are debating here, be it migration, unemployment, all stems from economic injustice and exploitation of mainly the global south countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Lastly, I have some housekeeping rules that the organizers kindly asked me to share with you. The next panel discussion, which is the open panel discussion, is going to be held at a different venue, which is just 3 minutes by walk from here, so don't worry about that, but do bring your coats because it's quite cold outside right now at the moment. And please go downstairs and meet at the front of the main gates, so the front of the doors. The gentleman in the back is very happy to show you the way around. And thank you so much, and allow me to thank the speakers of this panel as well, and thank you all who have participated in the conversation.